Alright, so today we are going to be learning about measurement, maps, and line plots. This is a third grade lesson plan. The objective for this lesson is that students will be able to measure distance with a ruler and plot the measurements that they make. Additionally, students will be able to compare and contrast any measurements that they make on the plot just as an extension of this objective. The Common Core standard for this lesson is to generate measurement data by measuring lengths using rulers marked with halves and fourths of an inch. Show the data by making a line plot where the horizontal scale is marked off in appropriate units, whole numbers, halves, or quarters. The academic language students will be learning in this lesson are measurement, chart, plot, ruler, half an inch, scale, and mile. In this lesson, the students will incorporate the different terms in this lesson through several language functions. And these are describing mathematical phenomena, and they will do this when they measure the distances on the map, and they will evaluate data in models by analyzing the data that they had collected from measuring on the maps and eventually putting them into the line plot and comparing and contrasting the data they received by looking at the line plot. So before this lesson begins, I'd like to review with my students the basic components of a ruler because that's going to be a key aspect in this lesson today. So a ruler, as most of the students should know, is 12 inches long. Now, a disclaimer about this video is that the rulers that are going to be shown in this video are not going to be exactly to scale, but we're going to use the measurements, the distances that they are, just as a visual representation of what the actual measurements would be. So just a disclaimer that they're not going to be exactly correct. So a ruler, like I said, has 12 inches. So between 0 and 1 is an inch. Between 1 and 2 is an inch. 2 and 3, and so on and so forth, all the way up till 12. So also, we're going to learn about half an inch. The half an inch mark is this big line that goes up, obviously halfway between 0 and 1, halfway between 1 and 2, 2 and 3. And this mark indicates that it is half of an inch, so it's half the distance between an inch. And there's another mark on the ruler that we're going to learn about, and this other mark is right here, and it is also right here. So there's two of these marks inside of the 1 inch, and this mark is the quarter inch mark. So you could have a quarter inch right here, you can have a quarter inch from here to here, and you can have a quarter inch from here to here. So you have 4 quarter inches in each inch. So let's begin the lesson. So what we're going to do for this lesson is we're going to follow Tom and Andy as they take a road trip across America. They're going to start in Seattle, visit several cities along the way, and they're going to end up in Washington, D.C., and we're going to measure the distance that each leg of their trip consists of. And for our measuring, we're going to use a ruler. And so because we're not able to measure 300 miles with the ruler, that would just take way too long, we are going to use a scale. So this scale has 0 to 300 miles, and we're putting our ruler straight up to the scale, and again, remember the ruler is not exactly to scale, but according to this, it says that the 300 miles is half of an inch, according on this map. So that's kind of what we're going to use to measure between each point of the map that Tom and Andy travel. Now let's look at our problem. So Tom and Andy are taking a cross-country road trip. They will be traveling starting in Seattle, then go to Phoenix, then Dallas, then St. Louis, then Chicago, and they will finally arrive in Washington, D.C. We're going to measure the distance between each city so Tom and Andy will know how far they are traveling. After measuring the distance traveled between each city, we will record the data in our chart. And we will also finally create a line plot to show the data that we collected. And we will compare and contrast each trip, which one took shorter, which one was longer, and if they have to travel the same distance more than once. So before we begin, we're just going to look over this question and notice some different vocabulary terms that are in this chart. So measure, what does it mean to measure? That's just taking your ruler and measuring between each distance. And we're also going to make a chart. And we're going to talk more about the chart when we begin to create it, when we begin to make the map. And when we start measuring, we're going to measure in ½ inch, but that's also going to be a mile. So the mile ultimately is what the measurement label that we're going to be using. So we're just going to go over one more time just the different points of the map and where we're going to be going. So this is the map again, and there's your scale with the ½ inch. So like I said, we're starting in Seattle, then to Phoenix, then to Dallas, St. Louis, Chicago, and Washington. So just so you have that visual representation of where we'll be going and measuring on this lesson. So let's start with our first leg of the trip. So the first leg of the trip was Seattle to Phoenix. So we're going to use the ruler and we're going to line it up right against this line here that we drew from Seattle to Phoenix. And that one doesn't fit, so we got to add another inch. And let's evaluate this measurement here. So like we said, 0 to 300 miles is approximately ½ an inch. So we're going to convert this over to our measurement. So we have 1/2 an inch right here. So that's 300 miles. And then we have another ½ an inch. That's another 300 miles. We have one more ½ an inch, and that's another 300 miles. So that's 900 miles from this point. And then we're just going to say we have a 1/4 inch right here just because it's not exactly to scale right yet. So we have about a 1/4 inch right here. So adding that on to the 900 miles that we already came up with here, that brings us to 1,050 miles from Seattle to Phoenix. So the next leg of the trip is, draw a nice line here from Phoenix to Dallas. We're going to mark our rulers right up to this, and we're going to see how many miles this trip takes. So from Phoenix to Dallas, they travel, this is a ½ an inch here, so this is 300 miles right here. Another ½ an inch would be another 300 miles, so that's 600 miles. And the last one is another 300 miles, and that's 900 miles. So this is our chart, and it has the first leg of the trip, Seattle to Phoenix, 1,050 miles, and the second leg of the trip, Phoenix to Dallas, 900 miles. All right, and the next leg of the trip, as we see by our line here, is from Dallas to St. Louis. And Dallas to St. Louis we're just going to go with that it has 2 halves. And like we said, 2 halves is 300 plus 300, which is 600. So from Dallas to Texas, Tom and Andy traveled 600 miles. And we can see that by looking at our chart right here. So the next leg of the trip was a pretty short distance. They traveled from St. Louis to Chicago, and let's see exactly how much that distance is. So if you look here, there's only a ½ an inch marked that we can see measured on the ruler here that matches with our red line. So a ½ an inch, looking up at our scale right here, is 300 miles. So from St. Louis to Chicago, Bill and Andy traveled 300 miles. And for our last leg of the trip, Chicago to Washington, D.C., we put our ruler up there. There's a ½ an inch here, so that's 300 miles. And another ½ an inch here, that's another 300 miles. So the last leg of the trip, 600 miles. So let's just review all of this information one more time. I went through it pretty fast, but we'll try and piece it all together. So we look at the map, and remember, looking at our scale. So first they started in Seattle. Then we traveled all the way to Phoenix, all the way to Dallas, then to St. Louis, that short trip to Chicago, and then the final leg to Washington, D.C. So let's look at this on our map and just try and remember the distance each trip took. So the first leg, Seattle to Phoenix, was 1,050 miles. The second leg from Phoenix to Dallas was 900 miles. The third leg from Dallas to St. Louis, 600 miles. And that short trip again from St. Louis to Chicago was only 300 miles. And the final leg from Chicago to Washington, D.C. was 600 miles. So now, after looking at all this data that we collected, we're going to move into the portion where we create the line plot. So for the purposes of this lesson, I've already created the line plot for you, but we're just going to review how I made it and why I made it, and then we're just going to discuss and compare the different results we see on this chart. So, like I said, this is our chart with all of our distances, and this is our line plot. So to kind of overview this line plot right here. So these numbers right here, most of them are the distances between each leg that Tom and Andy traveled, each leg of the trip. And the x's indicate x equals one trip. So x equals one leg of the trip. So if we look at this and kind of compare it to our chart to help us understand this, we can see that so in the distance of 300 miles, there was only one trip that took them 300 miles, and we know that that's St. Louis to Chicago. That's our short trip, remember. And then if we look at the second one is a trip that took 600 miles. And a trip that took 600 miles, there's two X's. So that means they had two trips that took them 600 miles. And if we reference back to our chart, that was Dallas to St. Louis and Chicago to Washington, D.C. And if we look at this portion of the chart right here, it says 900 miles, and there's only one X here, so that means only one trip took them 900 miles, and that's displayed here with Phoenix to Dallas. And if we look here, this is 1,000 miles. There's no X's in this section, so that means they didn't take any trips that were exactly 1,000 miles. And finally, the last leg of the trip here, it says 1,050 miles, and we know the first trip was very long, and that Seattle to Phoenix, and there's one X in here, so that took them 1,050 miles to get from Seattle to Phoenix. So just looking at this line plot, we can make a lot of comparisons. We can see how many trips were short, how many trips were long, how many times they had to take short trips or long trips. And you can really use this line plot for a lot of different purposes. I mean, if Tom and Andy were to stop in a lot of major cities in the United States, there would be a bunch more X's up here, and you'd be able to see which trips were short, which trips were long, if they were consistently traveling 600 miles between each stop they took, or if they wanted to take shorter stops or longer stops. You could really compare and contrast the different kinds of trips that they were making. So just something that I would do as an extension to this activity in my classroom would be to have students work on pairs to complete their own version of this activity. So I would give them a map and tell them go from here to here, and I'd give them a list of places to go, or I would even have them choose about 6 or 7 different spots on the map to measure and to choose where they go, and they'll do a lot of the same exact thing, measure it, chart it, and they would plot the measurements. And then I'd also have each group present to the class their results and any findings they found from looking at their line plot, comparing the different trips that they took or that I gave them. So that's all for this lesson today. Thank you for watching.